Hello again, Jared Pitts here, and today I'm going to be reading another article by Dr. Ray Peat. This one is called Autonomic Systems. Now, if you've heard anything about the parasympathetic versus the sympathetic nervous systems, then a lot of this is going to sound familiar, but of course, Dr. Peat is going to provide a unique perspective and most likely provide some balance to whatever extremes you or I have heard about these systems. Okay, before I get into the article, just wanted to remind you that I have several links in the description of this video. One being the link to my website, MissouriHealthCoach.com. I would love to be able to help you with your health journey. You can go ahead and click on that link and set up a free 15-minute consultation with me, and then we can go from there. Next, I also have a couple of links to some of my favorite companies that sell things like aspirin, desiccated thyroid, methylene blue, vitamin K2, vitamin D, etc. And I have a couple of discount codes in there so that if you use that discount code, you'll get anywhere from 5 to 20% off of your purchase. And these are companies that I use because I appreciate the quality of their product and also because they create products specifically around Dr. Peat's research and what he's shared with us. So, without further ado, this is how it goes. Historically, functions such as reason, emotion, and instinct were associated with particular nervous structures. And there was a reluctance to think that consciousness, like instinct, could be based on quote-unquote reflexes. Eventually, this led to the idea of an autonomous nervous system, which produced emotions and adjusted the body's functions, while the quote-unquote central nervous system was the seat of conscious thought, perception, and behavior. Our individual cells have a degree of autonomy consisting of the ability to sense their situation, integrate stimuli, and act adaptively. Their behavior is intelligently adaptive. The cells that make up the nervous system have this basic capacity for complex adaptive integration. But they also have the specialized role of serving as links between cells and the environment. The integration of the organism is most complete when the energy of each cell is optimal. The quote-unquote autonomic nervous system, including nerves that are closely associated with the diverse organs and tissues, is easiest to understand as a system for integrating and optimizing energy throughout the organism. This view suggests new ways of understanding imbalance in these nervous functions and the diseases that develop under the imbalanced conditions. For example, asthma, polycystic ovaries, menopausal symptoms, some skin diseases, multiple sclerosis, heart disease, and tumors. Every organ has its own intrinsic nerve net, and the cortex of the brain adjusts each system to meet the adaptive needs of the organism. When every cell is functioning optimally and the organism is adapted to its environment, there is little need for intervention by the quote-unquote transmitter substances. People like Walter Cannon and Wilhelm Reich popularized the idea of the autonomic nervous system, but they were just systematizing ideas that had been developing since the beginning of the century. Their views were the context in which Selye's idea of stress developed. The anatomical components of the nervous system that were called the sympathetic, or quote-unquote fight-or-flight, or adrenergic system, and the parasympathetic, or quote-unquote vegetative system are still important factors in physiological thinking. And despite the great complexity that has grown up around them, there is still a tendency to identify the systems with polarities of mood or emotion. The idea of polarities is useful, but it easily leads to error. The sympathetic system includes a chain of ganglia along the spine, and its functions include dilating the pupils and accelerating the heart. The parasympathetic system is also called the craniosacral system, from the location of its ganglia, and among its functions are slowing the heart and constricting the pupils. However, despite several decades of research, the actions of quote-unquote sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves in most organs are not understood. If the quote-unquote adrenaline side of the nervous system is responsible for the reactions to pain and threat, reactions of fear and rage, then the opposite side tends to be given attributes such as peace and pleasure. And the fact that these oppositions are often true has led to a climate in which the adrenergic reactions are seen as quote-unquote bad, and the opposite reactions as quote-unquote good. When adrenaline was identified as an agent of the sympathetic nervous system, there was a search for the quote-unquote opposing agent of the parasympathetic system. And I love how he is just going through the history of this. I mean, it is beautiful having read so much about this and then getting to see him just lay it out perfectly. So pay attention. Pay attention, class, because this is so good. And I can see where he's leading with this. And it is extremely important for us to understand. It will completely change how you view these. And then once these foundational ideas are altered, it completely changes how you see alternative medicine and allopathic medicine, and you're just going to see it through a more maybe critical, but what I might call a more balanced viewpoint. Okay, moving on. Histamine was an early candidate before acetylcholine was discovered to be the main parasympathetic agent. This view of histamine was fostered by the older idea of quote-unquote trophic nerves, which easily became identified with the parasympathetic system. When acetylcholine was identified as the transmitter or agent of the parasympathetic system, it tended to take on many of the qualities, including the quote-unquote trophic functions, that had grown up around the idea of the parasympathetic system. But the emphasis on acetylcholine led to a general neglect of the associations of histamine and the mast cells that produce much of it with the autonomic nervous system. The current trend seems to be emphasizing a close integration of mast cell function with nervous function. Nitric oxide has recently been identified as another parasympathetic quote-unquote transmitter. Nitric oxide and histamine are both very important factors in degenerative inflammatory diseases, but their association with the parasympathetic nervous system has given them an aura of benevolence. I'm not surprised to see nitric oxide in there, but I am surprised that they've been able to spin histamine in some way, because I think pretty much everyone has some type of negative association with histamine. Anyway, you see how at the foundation, when things are associated with other things, then they can misapply them, right? For example, nitric oxide. And I was just commenting on a post on the estrogen dominance group on Facebook, and someone was asking about beetroot powder, and people make this kind of distinction between, beetroot powder and bacon. Somehow the nitrates in bacon are so terrible, but the nitrates in beetroot powder, no, those are fine. But the fact that they all, they convert to nitric oxide in your body, and that nitric oxide, we see that it's associated with the parasympathetic, right? We know people take beetroot powder to lower their blood pressure, right? To lower their heart rate. And we can see the association here, and that's what, is associated with the parasympathetic side. But these nitrates, from like beetroot powder or from celery powder or whatever it is, they aren't necessarily just good because they may or may not be quote-unquote natural, right? A lot of these nitrates can be from just the fertilizer that they're dumping on these crops. But regardless, it's going to be converting into nitric oxide. And if you've read anything about nitric oxide with Dr. Peat, this causes angiogenesis, which is essentially the creation of new blood vessels. And this is how I believe the hair growing product out there on the market, you can probably guess what it is, but this is how it works, right? By increasing this blood vessel formation via nitric oxide where it's applied. And so, but guess what is also spread with angiogenesis and high nitric oxide, the big C word, right? And so, well, maybe this isn't something that we want to increase in our body. Okay, just a little bit of something to think about there. I think it's useful to compare the autonomic nervous system with the pituitary, not just because some of the pituitary hormones are called trophic hormones, for example, ludotrophic, adrenocorticotropic, but because their important adaptive functions can themselves be the cause of serious problems. An excess of the thyroid-stimulating hormone, or TSH, for example, causes degeneration and cancer development in the thyroid gland. And animals deprived of their pituitary gland but given thyroid live longer than intact animals. If slaves are starved and beaten frequently, they aren't very productive. They don't live long, and they might rebel. Workers that are healthy and working for a common goal that they understand are more productive. Cells that are well energized perform their functions with minimal cues, but deprived cells that have to be forced to function are likely to die unexpectedly, or to reproduce inappropriately, or to change their identity. Professors often make a strong impression on their students, but especially in technical or scientific fields, they usually do this by controlling the discourse, so that radical questioning is excluded. What they don't know, quote-unquote, isn't knowledge. Under the pressure of, quote-unquote, getting a professional education, students appreciate organizing principles and mnemonic devices, but this gives traditional ways of systematizing knowledge tremendous power that, in practice, is far more important than mere experimental results. And in parentheses we have experiments that don't acknowledge the ruling metaphors are almost universally considered inadmissible, unpublishable. Some obvious questions about the autonomic system have been commonly ignored or minimized by physiologists. If quote-unquote stress is the stimulus that causes the sympathetic system to increase its activity, what is the stimulus for increased activity of the parasympathetic system? What accounts for the relative balance between the two sides of the system or their imbalance? The fact that the answers aren't obvious has left the questions largely to psychiatrists and psychologists. Wilhelm Reich, who tried to provide answers in terms of developmental interactions between the organism and its environment, found that the question led him to investigate psychosomatic disease, sexual repression, cancer, and fascism, with disastrous results for himself. Chinese medicine was familiar with many of the functions of the autonomic nervous system, at a time when Western medicine was organized around the quote-unquote humors. It's easy for contemporary quote-unquote Western people to see that the quote-unquote winds and the hot and cold principles of Chinese tradition are metaphors, but they are reluctant to see that their own system has grown up within very similar traditional metaphoric polarities. Interesting. I'd never thought of it that way. The successes of even a good metaphor can cause people to neglect details that could support a more complete and accurate image of reality. Contemporary science carries a load of bad metaphors because the educational system doesn't tolerate a critical attitude. Potentially a good metaphor, for example, Vernadsky's suggestion that an organism is a quote-unquote whirlwind of atoms, could blow away many bad metaphors, but the present organization of science is tending in the other direction. Commercial interests are creating a culture in which their metaphors are replacing the traditional science in which there was a certain amount of honest intellectual exploration. In talking about consciousness, sleep, stress, biological rhythms, aging, and energy, I have often focused on the efficient use of oxygen for energy production by the mitochondria, i.e. cellular respiration. Every situation demands a special kind of adaptation, and each kind of adaptation requires a special distribution of cellular and organic activity, with its supporting local respiratory activity. There is a lot of local self-regulation in the adapting organism. For example, when the activated tissue produces increased amounts of carbon dioxide, which dilates blood vessels, delivering more oxygen and nutrients to the tissue. But the distribution of excitation and the harmonious balancing of the organism's resources and activities is achieved by the actions of the cortex of the brain, acting on the subordinate nerve nets, adjusting many factors relating to energy production and use. On the level of the mitochondria, adrenaline and acetylcholine have slightly different effects. Metabolic studies with isolated mitochondria are so remote from the normal cellular condition that their results are nothing more than a hint of what might be occurring in the cell. Acetylcholine appears to shift the proportion of the fuels used, increasing the oxidation of alpha ketoglutarate with the production of carbon dioxide, and increasing the efficiency of energy conservation, phosphorylation producing ATP, so that less oxygen is needed, while adrenaline increases the rate of oxygen consumption and succinate oxidation. This would be consistent with F.Z. Meerson's conception of the parasympathetic function as one of the quote-unquote stress-limiting systems. On the level of the whole cell, organ, and organism, the parasympathetic function limits oxygen consumption in a variety of ways, including the reduction of blood flow. Acetylcholine, like histamine and serotonin, activates glycolysis, the conversion of glucose to lactic acid, which provides energy in the absence of oxygen. That makes sense why it would activate glycolysis. If it's limiting oxygen consumption, then obviously you're going to need to get energy from somewhere, right? The effects of a little adrenaline and a lot of adrenaline are very different, with a high concentration of adrenaline decreasing the efficiency of phosphorylation. In the stressed heart, this effect of excess adrenaline can be fatal, especially when it is combined with adrenaline's acceleration of clotting, liberation of fatty acids, and frequently of calcium and constriction of blood vessels. Okay, so if that didn't make sense, liberation of fatty acids and calcium, and then also the constriction of blood vessels. 70 years ago, autonomic control of blood vessels seemed to be a matter of nerve fibers that constrict them, and other fibers that cause them to dilate. But that idea hasn't worked for a long time. Ever since I noticed that the students in our physiology lab who tried to use adrenaline to revive their rats weren't successful, I have wondered about the television shows in which adrenaline is given to patients with heart problems. Under some conditions, adrenaline does increase circulation to the heart, but extreme stress doesn't seem to be among those conditions. Too much serotonin, histamine, acetylcholine, and polyunsaturated fatty acids, like too much adrenaline, can cause spasms of the coronary arteries, along with disturbances of mitochondrial respiration. In stress, these substances are almost sure to be present in excess. Anti-serotonin drugs are effective for a variety of heart problems and other degenerative diseases. So he's talking about the EpiPen, right? In these extremely stressful situations. EpiPens, how do they work? Epinephrine, and that's just another name for adrenaline. Okay, so something to keep in mind as we go through here. By increasing the production of lactic acid and the loss of carbon dioxide, exaggerated nervous stimulation, especially the excess of acetylcholine, histamine, and serotonin, can cause a variety of problems, including generalized vasoconstriction and systemic alkalosis, as well as increased intracellular alkalinity. This metabolic pattern is characteristic of many kinds of stress, including cancer. Elsewhere, I have referred to this pattern as quote-unquote relative hyperventilation. The metabolic effects probably account for some of the quote-unquote paradoxical effects of the autonomic agents. Right, and he's pushing back against so many misunderstood ideas that just get repeated over and over in the quote-unquote health world. For example, the idea that alkalizing your body is somehow going to fight against, the C word, right? But look what he's saying. What happens with this increase of lactic acid, right? Systemic alkalosis. Increased intracellular alkalinity, okay? These things are actually associated with the big C word, okay? When nutrition and thyroid function, light, atmospheric pressure, and other conditions are favorable, the autonomic transmitters, for example acetylcholine, histamine, serotonin, and adrenaline, and pituitary hormones and other quote-unquote signal substances are kept within safe limits. Because the substances released from various cells under the influence of the autonomic nerves, histamine and serotonin for example, stimulate cell division. Injuries which produce clots and vascular spasms will also stimulate the formation of new blood vessels, a process that is essential for the adaptation of tissues to prolonged stress. All right, and that's that angiogenesis that I was talking about earlier, caused by increased nitric oxide. These stress-induced agents are appropriately included in the quote-unquote vegetative or parasympathetic nervous system because they promote vegetation, i.e. the proliferation of substance. And you can see why maybe that word isn't commonly heard around parasympathetic. You usually hear quote-unquote rest and digest, right? But vegetative doesn't have quite the good association with it. Adrenaline and the sympathetic nerves have the opposite function of restraining cell division, and they also oppose the pro-inflammatory functions of those parasympathetic agents. Estrogen tends to shift autonomic balance toward the parasympathetic side, away from the sympathetic/adrenergic. Recalling that stress, hypothyroidism, and aging increase the activity of aromatase in various tissues with local production of estrogen, and that tissue-bound estrogen stays at a high level in postmenopausal women despite the lower level of estrogen in the serum, it's worthwhile looking at the effects of estrogen on the various components of the so-called autonomic nervous system. I feel like that should all be in bold, right? If we see that estrogen shifts you toward the parasympathetic side, and we know cell proliferation is an attribute of estrogen, right? What it's used for at the very beginning of fertilization, while also accompanied by extremely high levels of progesterone to protect from the negative effects of that, we can see how what we've been told about these two quote-unquote opposing nervous systems may not be all the way true. One injection of estrogen can induce a large increase in the number of sympathetic nerves in the ovaries. At menopause, a similar quote-unquote invasion of sympathetic nerves occurs. The polycystic ovary, which is even more common after menopause than before, and some studies have found the condition in 20% of premenopausal women, responds to estrogen by producing nerve growth factors and growing a large number of new sympathetic nerves. Although the hyperestrogenism associated with the polycystic ovary syndrome has many harmful effects, the invasion of the ovary by adrenergic nerves apparently protects it from the development of cancer. Parasympathetic nerves, pituitary hormones, and mast cells activate the ovaries. The number of mast cells in the ovaries is increased by the pituitary hormones, including the thyroid-stimulating hormone, or TSH, and by estrogen, and there's a study there. Estrogen is the most potent of these hormones in causing the cells to release histamine. The overgrowth of the sympathetic nerves in the polycystic ovary causes the number and activity of mast cells to decrease, possibly as a protective adaptation against excessive stimulation from the many pro-inflammatory factors. The mast cells are needed for the follicles to rupture, so their suppression prevents ovulation. Okay, and so you're kind of getting a peek into the typical monthly cycle of a woman, right? When estrogen rises, why is it rising? What happens because it's rising? What happens when you have a lower ratio of progesterone to estrogen? Okay, so anyway, some really important information that you can use to kind of understand, all of that physiology. The nervous system is closely involved in controlling the growth of tissues, and it has been argued, R.E. Kavetsky reviewed the subject in his book emphasizing the role of depression in development of cancer, that cancer results from reduced activity of the sympathetic nerves, or unopposed action of the parasympathetic system. That stress has a role in cancer is acknowledged by the scientific establishment, but the nervous system's direct involvement in the regulation of cellular metabolism, cell division, and other processes that are central to the cancerous state is either flatly denied or simply ignored. Although mast cells have been known to be a common component of tumors for many years, it is only recently that antihistamines and other anti-inflammatory drugs have been recognized as valuable therapies in cancer. The whole issue of the role of nerves in tumor development and physiology has been submerged by the mystique of the quote-unquote intrinsically bad cancer cell. Okay, and he's getting at the root here where people's idea of a cancer cell being just intrinsically bad, and there's no way around. You either got to cut it out, poison it, punch it in the face, okay? If that is your perception, then it's going to be easy to manipulate the choices you make once you are told, those famous words, you have cancer, right? So like he's saying, there's actually valuable therapies, and is it possible that that cell isn't quote unquote bad? It isn't, in an irreversible state, right? Moving on. In Alzheimer's disease, there has been a great investment in the doctrine that drugs to promote the function of cholinergic or acetylcholine-forming nerves will restore lost mental function. Okay, so if you've missed all the rest of it, this is what you want to listen to. Listen to this part. This is so important. Why are Dr. Peat's articles so important? Because, you might be young now, or I don't know how old you are, but as you get older, you're going to have to deal with issues, whether it's with family members, friends, okay? So many people get just dragged through the system because they just assume that their doctor knows what they're talking about, right? But he's done this entire article has led up to this, okay? He's showing how all of this information is used in the medical system to sell you something. And you might want to rethink it. I'm not giving advice here. I'm just saying we have to be informed consumers. If you're not informed, you're going to hurt yourself. And it can only be our fault, right? At this point, the whole system is built. The whole system is built against us, built against you. I hate to say it. I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist here. I'm just saying there are so many cogs in this machine that have no idea what every other cog is doing that we can almost not blame the doctors, the nurses, the schools, etc., anymore. It is 100% on us, though, to learn this and to share this with the people around us, because people are being hurt by this system, and we can help them. Okay, so again, this whole article leading up to this, please listen to this part. Okay. In Alzheimer's disease, there has been a great investment in the doctrine that drugs to promote the function of cholinergic or acetylcholine-forming nerves will restore lost mental function, or at least retard the progression of the disease. The success of anti-cholinergic drugs in treating several degenerative brain diseases is probably embarrassing to the companies whose cholinergic intensifying drugs aren't very successful. Conveniently for them, these formerly quote-unquote anti-cholinergic drugs are now being called anti-excitotoxic or anti-glutamatergic drugs. There is no serious conflict in the terminology, since the cholinergic processes, like the serotonergic processes, right, referring to serotonin, are closely associated with excitotoxic nerve damage. The cholinergic drugs will probably be sold as long as their patents are effective, and then will be quietly forgotten. Okay, understand this. People have been sold this lie that cholinergic nerves need to be promoted in order to restore mental function. But for some reason, anticholinergic drugs are treating degenerative brain diseases. What? It makes no sense. And he's got other articles showing different diseases where people were literally being administered cholinergic and anticholinergic drugs for the same thing. Okay? It's mind-boggling. The modern conception of pharmacology, with receptors and transmitters turning functions on or off, has turned into an unproductive and dangerous scholasticism. No one will ever successfully count the number of transmitter angels dancing on the variable sites of the variable receptor molecules. The functional quote-unquote meaning of a receptor or transmitter changes according to circumstances, and the effect of activating a particular nerve depends on surrounding conditions and on preceding conditions. Each cell integrates stimuli adaptively. If no reflex is simply mechanical and innate, then all reflexes are conditional. M. Merleau-Ponty argued against the validity of the reflex concept itself because of this conditionality. P.K. Anakin's concept of the quote-unquote acceptor of action, described in my book Mind and Tissue, provides an image in which we can see the set points for the relatively quote-unquote autonomic reflexes as reflections of the general needs of the organism. The local tissue reflexes, the organ reflexes, the spinal reflexes, etc. are variable according to their energetic resources and according to the way in which they are organized under the influence of the cerebral cortex and the environment. The reality is more complex than the philosophy of the drug industry imagines, but the solutions of problems can be much simpler if we think in terms of energetic support rather than over-concretized interventions of the pharmacologists. In hypothyroidism, it is common for there to be an excess of adrenaline/noradrenaline, serotonin, histamine, and some of the pituitary hormones. Correcting thyroid function can immediately correct many problems, but especially when the energy deficiency is caused, anatomical adjustments, redistribution of blood vessels and mast cells, for example. It's important to make the environment supportive in as many ways as possible. All right, key word there, energetic. All right, this is the whole quote-unquote pro-metabolic community. What does that mean? It's just pro-energetic, creating energy. This is what life is, right? This physical life, right, is energetic. And I'm sure we could go into the philosophy and all kinds of philosophy there, but let's avoid that for now. Last two paragraphs. In polycystic ovaries, menopausal symptoms, arthritis, angina pectoris, multiple sclerosis, some kinds of dementia, migraine, and emphysema, the relief achieved with a simple improvement of cellular, here we go, energy can be rapid and complete. Presumably, a similar process of biological reorganization is involved in the occasional spontaneous regression of tumors. Although I don't think the autonomic nervous system, with its sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, exists in the way it has traditionally been conceived, the idea can be useful if we think of using drugs and other factors in ways that tend to quote-unquote, and this is in bold, quiet an overactive autonomic nervous system. All right, man, what an article. Absolutely loved this article. So much in there. Here's his references, go through those on your own time, and there are a lot. If you had any light turning on moments throughout that article, if you wouldn't mind sharing them in the comments, please like the video, share with the people that need to hear this, right? How many people in your life have Alzheimer's and are being prescribed these these cholinergic drugs? All right, anyway, this is all for research purposes only, educational only. Hope you enjoyed the article. Until next time, God bless.